So, hello, Max.
Hi, Jen.
So it's a great honor to have you with us again. To remind our listeners and our viewers, Max DeGregorio is the Associate Director of the FinTech Office at Milken, at the Milken Institute. And we're wrapping up a series with Max that we've held over the past several months on the role of FinTech in development. And this is an issue that became really important here in the United States, but overseas as well after the demise of the U.S. Agency for International Development. It's an issue that Max has always had on his radar. And over the past several years, he's cultivated a really important expertise in this topic. And we thought we'd take advantage of his expertise to help those of us who are trying to understand the role of this important technology in the role in foreign assistance, and especially given the tectonic shifts that we've seen in global development and especially international aid, what role does fintech play? So Max has written a really nice policy brief for us on the role of digital assets and their role in development assistance and aid. And so Max, going to ask you a lot of questions about this. And basically you talk about stable coins and you talk about a range of digital assets. But before we get into the specifics, can you just tell us what is the role that digital assets play in development assistance and how is this changing?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jen. And it's been a delight to sort of organize this series with you over the course of the fall and sort of bring all these different speakers together. And it's sort of allowed me to sit down and sort of put together, paint a broader picture of the role that this technology is playing, right? Like you said, the USAID is no longer what it was, and additionally, you're looking at sort of other major European donors sort of pulling back in their public assistance for aid and development work, and as a result, like you're seeing sort of this big global shortfall in development funding, and like the key role that I'm at least seeing digital assets play, based on my conversations with the people we've had in the series, the people that I'm speaking with on a daily basis, is like, how can you make sort of the limited funding left go further? Or how can you sort of do more with the resources that you have? And we've been looking at that sort of in the context of disintermediation, right? How do you get aid and resources directly to beneficiaries, to end users, to people? How are you able to move money more with more agility, right? Faster, cheaper, over borders? And then how are you able to do that in a way that reassures sort of skeptical donors? Like, be that like an increasingly skeptical public sector, or how are you able to move money in a way that gets reassures private sector donors? And we'll talk about the traceability elements of digital assets there. But first, I'd maybe like to sort of start with what are stablecoin, because that's something that we've sort of talked about
Mhm.
in the context of this series for a little bit. And a stablecoin are a type of digital asset which sort of have qualities that will make them more useful in that development context. A
And how do
normal,
they differ
yeah,
from
from
a
a
stable
standard,
coin is different from
like
Bitcoin,
a
right?
Bitcoin, right? And
Yeah.
so in the world of digital assets, you have all sorts of sort of virtual tokens and currencies, and their values really fluctuate. You see enormous volatility, right? The original digital asset was a Bitcoin, and the price of Bitcoin can swing sort of wildly, right? And so this year alone, we've seen Bitcoin hit an all-time high of $120,000 a coin, and going down almost 40% in value, getting very close to $80,000 a coin at some point this fall. It's a massive volatility. That kind of volatility is your means of payment and settlement. You cannot use Bitcoin in a development context, right? Unless you're sending money with it, and you're almost immediately liquidating it, on the sending or receiving side. It's just the price of it goes up and down too much for donors to interact with and be able to use it as a means of account, and then for people to deploy it practically on the ground in a development context, right? So
Can
that's
I
sort of
ask a
your core
silly
problem.
question here? Why is it so volatile?
So the price of Bitcoin is volatile because there's nothing that underpins the value of Bitcoin beyond just the supply and demand of buyers and sellers. And that just changes dramatically day to day, depending on how much capital is coming sort of in and out of the broader crypto economy, how much demand there is to use Bitcoin as a means of sort of cross-border instantaneous payment settlement. There are also like software networks that are built on top of Bitcoin that are used to process transactions at a slightly lower cost. And this maybe is outside the purview of this conversation, but you can think Bitcoin is almost like a base layer of software, and there are applications on top of it that settle payments. And demand for those other layers of payment settlement also fluctuate the price of the underlying asset. And then what you're seeing more recently in Bitcoin is a leverage being introduced into the market. Right. So you have speculation in the Bitcoin market. People are taking out loans collateralized against Bitcoin. Sudden swings in the price can bring in margin calls. And so you have a whole sort of suite of forces that are pushing Bitcoin's price up and down. Among investors, Bitcoin is kind of seen as some see it as a proxy for gold, as a deflationary basic economics. You can only have 21 million individual Bitcoins. They can be divided down pretty small, but there's only so many that can exist. But then at the same time, it's seen as almost a proxy for the technology sector. So when you have sort of high-end technology stocks going up, your Bitcoin also will sort of go up with it. It exists on the very, very far end of the risk curve among sort of some investors. And so you have, again, like a speculative angle, and then you also have sort of changing demand of throughput for the network, and that can sort of change the underlying price.
So you don't want to be using, the instability puts people in developing countries in precarious position because the value fluctuates so often, and you've nicely explained why that is. And so
Exactly.
this, yeah.
And this is and like a big reason in developing countries where you don't want to hold you could if you hold Bitcoin as a store of value, and then over the course of 4 or 5 months the value drops by 40%. Like in some cases you're better holding a depreciating local currency. It can be a very risky proposition, especially for people in vulnerable places. So yes. But then the solve for the volatility that was sort of created by the digital asset industry maybe 15 years ago was stablecoin. And so that they took this idea. It's like, all right, well, we have this technology that can sort of represent a digital token, right? A digital claim to an asset cryptographically online. We can send it from wallet to wallet, but we can we issue a token that has no volatility relative to some other asset? Right? Can we issue some kind of digital currency where it is pegged to the dollar 1 to 1? And that is the
Mm.
goal of the stable coin. And so a stable coin is one of these digital tokens where there's a sort of an issuer that is sitting on a reserve of, and ideally there's an issuer sitting on a 1 to 1 reserve, or even an over collateralized, greater than 1 to 1 reserve of dollars or short-term US treasuries. And you're you're able to redeem your token sort of at a fixed rate to those dollar-based assets. So sort of similar to how you would maintain a currency peg back in the days before fiat money.
And these stable coins are backed by central banks.
No, so
No.
stablecoins themselves are not backed by central banks. For the most part, stablecoins are backed by these private issuers that are maintain these large reserves of U.S. dollars and dollar-denominated assets. So the largest two stablecoins in the world are Tether and Circle. And Circle is regularly audited, at least in the U.S., because of new regulations. And you can see, the regular audits that come out from Circle that they have exactly as many dollars and dollar denominated liquid assets in reserve as they have stablecoin in circulation. And sort of this mechanism, ability for these sort of private organizations to peg these tokens directly to a dollar, creates a situation where you can have sort of a reliable store of value, at least as determined in dollars, which is particularly useful for like accounting, sending money overseas, of understanding how much value you have in your transmitting. It solves the volatility issue associated with Bitcoin. And you get to keep all of the advantages. So you get to maintain that instant global settlement. You get to maintain the traceability and trackability of some of these public blockchain ledgers, and you get to also keep the divisibility, the ability to divide these tokens up into much smaller subunits, so you can transmit small, sort of precise amounts of money as needed for a relatively low cost. Uh, if you had sort of another stablecoin point, is there something you wanted me to sort of describe in a
Yeah,
little bit more detail
yeah,
there?
just and so these stable coins, these are for-profit operators, right?
Yes.
So Circle, and now Circle is based in the US and is now regulated by the US government,
Hmm.
correct?
Correct.
Okay. And there are other countries that have the central banks. This is why I was asking you about central banks. Yes.
So
Before
there
we get
are
into the
other
development
countries
parts, right? Yeah.
So there are other countries that are doing something called a central bank digital currency, and the United States has pursued very intentionally a private sector first strategy for rolling these things out. But you have other countries that have tried to create a digital version of their own currency that is stored on a blockchain that sort of runs on these tokenized networks. They, you know, the relative success of those products is debatable. There's a lot of a lot of countries that have rolled these out early where countries were already there was demand for the local currency was wasn't enormous, right? You already have sort of issues of sort of local trust, and people were already maybe looking for an alternative way to denominate value. And so we haven't seen sort of enormous success with a lot of these CBDC projects yet. I think that the biggest success for CBDCs is sort of coming out of Brazil. Like Brazil, you've seen like this network called Pix, which is a sort of an instant settlement and transaction network that banks in Brazil use. But they're also working on a central bank digital currency pilot called Drex, DREX, which would attempt to sort of create a digital real that could settle between the different Brazilian banks in a way, that's similar to a private sector stablecoin. But ultimately, the private sector model took off because there's huge demand for these for US dollars around the world, and these digital dollar tokens are accessible anywhere that you have an internet connection. Although, the US Treasury, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank didn't really kick these off. The conditions sort of exist for these products to be built, and there's sort of a great deal of demand. Initially, it all came from the cryptocurrency trading sector. So those people dealing with that volatility problem in Bitcoin we discussed initially, they wanted sort of after they were cashing out of their Bitcoin position, they didn't want to quite get back into dollars. They wanted to have some kind of intermediary asset with a relatively stable value. And so people normally liquidate Bitcoin and put it into stablecoin. And it
Okay.
initially just sort of served as this thing in trading. But what we've seen more and more in emerging markets is this sort of demand to be able to buy dollar denominated assets, right? To use a dollar denominated savings vehicle, especially you have places with currency controls. You have places where your ability to buy US dollars is sort of limited to some quota that you can only get so many US dollars every week. And these dollar tokens sort of provide sort of a credible workaround to use a dollar denominated savings vehicle. And that's where you're seeing a lot of interest in emerging markets, and also sort of a lot of questions from the issuers of local currencies themselves, who are sort of worried about the risks of dollarization, who are worried about a transition to a US dollar denominated digital economy in their countries, even if that's not a policy they want to themselves to implement. Their people are sort of voting with their feet or voting with their
Okay.
wallets.
So the US isn't going to adopt
Yeah, not officially, not a former federal level, but the private issuers of stablecoins are certainly taking off here, right? So we have the
okay.
biggest private issuer, the biggest regulated private issuer Circle is currently based here in the U.S. And a sort of a whole host of other financial institutions in the U.S. are now considering pilot programs to sort of have their own digital dollars. It's reminiscent, Jen, of sort of the late 1800s. You had like wildcat dollars for a little bit, where sort of banks in the American West,
Wildcat dollars. Yes.
you could issue, banks or financial institutions that receive permission from the Treasury Department to sort of mint their own private dollars that were effectively a legal tender. And before we had the Federal Reserve System, it's sort of although stablecoins are not legal tender, and you use sort of a very cash-like instrument to some extent.
So now, take us, you've walked us through, the Bitcoins, the digital assets. Now we know what stable coins are. They're more regulated, they're pegged, they're stable, and
Sure.
they're ideal, right? For,
Ideally there,
okay.
exactly. And so just before we get into the development context, like what's changed in the US to make stablecoins more attractive is this regulation. Historically, stablecoins can depeg. And we've seen it. And especially there's another class of stablecoin that's almost entirely discredited called an algorithmic stablecoin,
Hmm.
which does not maintain a currency reserve, and they sort of are actively buying and selling their currency on the market to maintain their peg. That those have historically depegged, and those are not regulated in the U.S. Those are not legal. What we have in the U.S. are reserve-backed stable coins, and to be compliant, you have to be regularly audited. You have to meet certain reserve requirements. You have to have a certain type of asset mix. You have to, show that you're segregating your reserves. You need to meet these standards in order to sort of guarantee to the market this instrument is not going to depeg. Because principally, what keeps the value of a stablecoin at 1 to 1 is the market's trust and confidence and understanding that there is ultimately enough US dollar reserves 1 to 1 to redeem a stablecoin on demand.
Hmm.
And that sort of confidence has they've U.S. legislators have done their best to enshrine sort of those things into law,
Okay.
to make it so that we can have as much confidence as possible that they won't depeg when they're issued and regulated in the U.S. And you have U.S. dollar stablecoins circulating that have been issued outside of the U.S. who are not compliant with our rulemaking process, and they may claim they have the reserves, but you never really know until you sort of look under the hood, which is what we've done sort of here in the U.S. But now that you have this legal framework in the U.S., you can, to the for the absolute most part, trust the reserves. You're in a position where you're getting more and more institutions that are looking at this technology and saying, all right, how can we build with this, right? You take advantage of instant global settlement, cross-border flexibility, these traceable, auditable transaction records, and that is where I've started to see sort of an interesting conversation coming together in the development space that we've sort of had on this during this series
Yeah.
over the fall.
Okay, so then explain to us, just to take a step back when we think about what's happened in the development space. And I always hate calling it the development space. I think it's more the aid space, right? And one of the reasons I really don't like using that term development is because it presupposes that aid is a trigger of development. And I think that is a big question. And so when we think about the role of these currencies in, or what's happened in the broader development sphere over the past year, especially here in the United States,
Uh-huh.
we've seen the elimination of the U.S. Agency for International Development. And many people said, well, this is the end of U.S. aid or the U.S. role in foreign assistance or development assistance. And I've always been hesitant to say that because we haven't seen aid go away completely. And I believe that what has happened is that the effort to eliminate USAID was actually targeted at the intermediaries, that was targeted at getting rid of the NGOs, many of the NGOs and the contractors that were distributing aid. I think this was one of the targets, and that the aid would be moved from this independent agency, USAID, into the State Department, as it has in many other countries in the world. We've seen the elimination of these independent standalone aid agencies and a move towards putting them in the foreign ministry or the State Department, as it is called here in the United States. And what this effectively did is eliminated a lot of the NGOs that were distributing aid. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because it seems that this technology is another role to I think you said it very well, de-intermediarize. Say it, you can say it better than I can.
Yeah, disintermediate.
Disintermediate, thank you. That was a word an expression I had not yet heard before. These transactions and get donors closer to recipients, which really allows this technology to, achieve some of these political objectives, at least I see, or their efficiency gains from eliminating some of these intermediaries that really consumed a great deal of the assistance, right, to pay the workers. And so this allows donors to get closer to recipients. Is that
Yes.
yes?
And so that is, I'd say, a fair assessment, and something that we focused on sort of a lot when we did this series this fall. And like the disintermediation point, I think is powerful in the sense that like a lot of the clearest applications of digital assets in the development context have come from this in the aid context, right? A couple of cases that I cite in the piece I drew up based on sort of our insights this fall was you have the UNDP sort of working with some of these stablecoin issuers, Circle, the Stellar Development Foundation, who sort of issue these and maintain the networks that these tokens run on, to immediately send aid to refugee camps, right, directly into people's digital wallets, and create into parts of the world where there's also sort of the ability to cash out those digital dollars into a local currency, but also create ways to sort of use those digital dollars to sort of buy things online as well. But yes, like that's sort of a clear example. Like the UNDP has been able to sort of directly send digital dollars using these channels to people that need them in areas where there are refugees. But you also see sort of pilot programs that even have sort of been launched by what you would see as maybe some of the traditional NGOs that operate in the space, like Oxfam has piloted some programs with this, sending money sort of directly to people's digital wallets. In Vanuatu, see there's the organization Mercy Corps, which is so very present in East Africa, has also been experimenting with sending a digital asset sort of directly to recipients into wallets, digital wallets, and then also we had a sort of a great conversation with Skylar Badenoch from Hope for Haiti, spoke at the CGM this fall, and he was able to sort of talk about sort of a pilot program that did the exact same thing. Right, it was able to directly send digital assets into the wallets of mothers in Haiti who were able to cash that money out locally, sort of, and buy what their families needed. And those pilot programs are like you said, they're going directly to people on the ground that are using this aid and this money, and you don't have to move money through. It's not only, you're not just sort of disintermediating your traditional sort of aid NGOs who are still in these contexts a lot of the time coordinating the flow of this money.
Okay.
You're also disintermediating the local banking system, which it's a question of where, depending on your development goals, or where you're doing your aid work. If the local system is massively sort of corrupt or inefficient, or due to some sort of natural disaster is unable to sort of move money quickly, you're disintermediating that legacy payments
Okay. Right.
infrastructure, which is another way to think about what's also being disintermediated.
Which is really so, on the one hand, it's really important in these contexts, these weakly institutionalized environments where banks can be quite corrupt and it's hard to access. There's extremely high rates of transfer rates. But wouldn't that also undermine the institutions in
Yes.
these contexts? Right.
So that's an interesting question, and like a balance, right? You have to consider, right? Especially when you're deploying this like technology for in the context of aid and development, right? Like you want to build up these institutions, right? You want them to be credible over the long term. You want to incentivize them to perform well, to grow, to build local capacity. And while this technology is helpful to circumvent, what could be sort of corrupt systems or untrustworthy systems, yes, it prevents the flow of these aid dollars into those local banking institutions if they're used in the way that we're talking about here. What we haven't seen is stablecoins deployed yet, sort of at scale, to see what the effect of this would be on those aid and development institutions, right? Like only sort of a very limited amount of the aid that's gone into places like Haiti has gone on those digital asset rails, and still like the great majority of it moves on those traditional banking rails. So I'm very interested to sort of track and follow that, and see if there is ultimately maybe a detriment to those local institutions. For the most part, the donors that I've spoke to, they've been able to move money on these rails, and sort of the NGOs that have tested these pilot programs have said that the agility that they're afforded by being able to move this directly without having to rely on local intermediaries to get aid into these countries, into these less institutionalized places, has been at least beneficial on the scale that they've attempted it.
Okay. So where do you see then this? I mean, obviously, and Also, I just want to actually, before we go down this route, I want to separate this role of using Bitcoin, stable coins for development, which is distinct from using the blockchain.
Yes.
Okay. So, because this series is really intended to help people understand these technologies who don't have a strong background in them. So we're beginning to see organizations like the World Bank, for example, use the blockchain for asset management. And that is very different. That is just for traceability and to
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about this?
So the blockchain itself, it's a technology that allows sort of decentralized record keeping and storage. It is it's almost like a ledger, like a big Microsoft Excel spreadsheet almost. Like a ledger that tracks transactions that happen on the network, but that ledger is sort of stored across a huge global network of computers that are running and maintaining the network, but there's no one single point of failure. And that network is cryptographically secured, and so it's verifiable by the different validators that are running the network, so that you have a degree of trust in the contents of that ledger. So it's a big record keeping software. And the first application that ran on that record keeping software, for the most part, was a digital currency, right? Cryptocurrency, Bitcoin. But when you hear like something like the World Bank is using it to sort of track and trace assets, it's just a large, verifiable, decentralized data storage network or ledger. You can use blockchains to track
Right. I just
supply
wanted
chain,
to
whatever.
Yeah, supply. So this is a very distinct because I think that there's so much conflation or confusion right now, at least when I'm talking to people about blockchain, Bitcoin, stablecoin, all of these things, really to just spell out very clearly about the different roles that this technology plays. It's multifaceted and it's not just putting, resources in people's pockets. It's actually providing an infrastructure to reduce corruption in terms of
So
managing
then
value
then
chains.
this is also then this gets into another context that's helpful in development. So another point I talk about is this idea of traceability and trackability. And this is something that is inherent in sort of the blockchain infrastructure layer, right? So whether you're moving virtual dollars on a network, or if you're just sort of like tracking supply chains, cargo shipments on these networks, or you just need sort of an auditable trail of transactions to give back to donors, return to donor governments, or private individuals, or foundations. That is a component that you can get from blockchains, that trackability, that traceability. And so what happens in the easiest example is the digital money, because it's the most widely used. But every time a transaction happens and it's stored on one of these networks, record can be pooled up. It can be audited, and you can see, all right, well, this money moved from this address to this address at this timestamp, which is helpful for tracking and tracing the flow of funds. Now, there are some blockchain networks that have been developed that run without that like tracking and tracing capability, but those are not the networks that people are looking at to use in the context of development. Those are sort of more for internal transactions at like financial institutions, where some degree of privacy or auditability on demand is useful. In the context of development, most stablecoins are sort of running on public permissionless blockchains, or blockchains where the data set of all the transactions is actually easily publicly auditable by anyone who wants to pull up the log.
So where do you see all of this going? I mean, so obviously the introduction of these stable coins makes it more palatable and easier
Hmm.
um, to use these technologies to transfer money, but it doesn't seem to get around sort of the traditional problem that we see in development assistance, where there's debates about cash transfers.
Hmm.
Is this effective? So it makes the transactions easier to get to people.
Hmm.
Some of the examples I think we saw over the course of the past several months is, knowing when a disaster might happen and getting resources to people before the hurricane hits so that they can buy whatever they need using microloans or whatever before the disaster hits so they can, shore up their property. Really amazing uses of this technology. But when you are transferring funds or transferring cash, the technology is new, but it doesn't really get around those
No.
traditional debates. if is this technology, is our cash transfers really an effective means of developing or deploying development aid?
I think in that context, you're absolutely right that, those big examples we've highlighted are cash transfers directly to people, disintermediations right to the individual level. And that, I think the debate, is still open in development circles. Maybe to sort of paint a different picture or show where maybe you can disintermediate to maybe a lesser degree. You also have a context where, instead of saying, all right, let's use this technology to send cash transfers, let's use this technology to send money to development organizations or NGOs that are operating on the ground in a region, in a Haiti, in an East Africa context, in a Middle Eastern context. But you want to send, let's say, you're sending development assistance to a local organization, and you want to realize sort of the same benefits of disintermediation that you're seeing with direct cash for transfers to individuals, where you want to be able to move the money or the funding, without going through a local financial system that you may or may not trust or may not have the capacity to handle your aid. And, you also are interested in sort of a degree of safety and security as to where those assets are stored. So a story I heard that was sort of interesting over the fall was that, you're sending aid via stablecoin to sort of a local organization that is going to go do its development work on the ground. If you were to sort of send dollars in the past, those dollars would again sit in a local financial institution and be
Mhm.
drawn on by the organization. By sending them stable coins, tokenized sort of representations of digital dollars that they can liquidate for dollars as they need to, the dollars, right, the US Treasury bills, the liquid US dollars, the assets themselves are sitting in a regulated custodian inside the United States. So even if you're just which eliminates sort of the risk of sort of keeping these assets sort of out of the United States in sort of certain contexts. Which again sort of brings back your question from earlier. And is it beneficial or is it harmful to the development of these countries to not have these assets stored in their local institutions? But some aid organizations might find it beneficial to or the donors might
Right.
find it reassuring to say, all right, so the U.S. dollars, the treasury assets that are sort of backing uh, um, um, the development work is sitting in a U.S. registered custodian onshore in the USA, and we're still able to take those assets and deploy it and use it to achieve whatever goals NGO operating on the ground would want to achieve, which I thought was a sort of also a different way to think about disintermediation as well. Right, you're not
Right.
going directly to the individual, to a person's digital wallet to do the direct cash transfers, but you're taking just a part of that cash transfer process to create maybe a new opportunity of how you want to store those assets or keep the money moving in the process. But I think it still raises some of the exact same questions you raised earlier about capacity building and local financial institutions.
So there's no panaceas that we see in development. We're
No, so
all
it's not
looking
gonna
for.
solve you're still gonna have all the same problems you had before, I think in the context of development, right? The real work still has to be done on the ground by local organizations, by practitioners. But it's just a question of we now have a new option as to, like, sort of how we want to send and deploy funds in the development context. Because this technology on its own doesn't necessarily solve the challenges, but it's a new tool in the toolbox, right? It allows you to maybe do a little bit more with a little bit less. It allows you to maybe change how your donors are thinking about the riskiness of certain projects in certain regions. It changes, the calculus at a government that's a little bit more stringent about how do we track and trace the assets we've deployed.
So, we've talked about, the potential for success and all the possibilities, but also want to be and also reminding ourselves that these currencies, these efforts to deploy resources face the same kind of constraints that just about everything else does. It's just a new technology that uses it, disintermediates. Where do you see the risks or the limitations with this approach going forward?
So the risks and limitations are There's a couple of them that sort of I'll address. The biggest and clearest risk to me is the sort of the reserve asset or depegging risk. You have sort of large organizations that are deploying this in an aid or development context, a disaster relief context. You want to ensure that whatever asset you're using holds the value that you claim it holds, and so sort of a robust policy to prove the reserves that back stablecoins in particular, uh, and to make sure that they're a dependable medium of aid is necessary, right? So the reserve requirements that we've implemented in the U.S. for this, again, have dramatically lowered that risk and made U.S. regulated stablecoins safe enough that people have started to really experiment with them in earnest. But the risk remains for stablecoins issued outside of the United States, stablecoins that are not compliant with U.S. regulatory frameworks. That I would caution development practitioners against. I think that's a very serious risk. You need to, if you're going to be using this technology or taking advantage of it, work with the most sort of well-regulated, well-capitalized, transparent issuers that are sort of following the rules in the United States. So that's one sort of a big risk factor. Um, and then sort of other risk factors that are sort of being addressed now in the United States is sort of making sure that we have sort of robust and anti-money laundering and know your customer, know your buyer sort of compliance, right? Who is buying who is acquiring the assets, who is sending them where, sort of to who. And I think in the development context, especially aid originating from the government or private donors and going through sort of NGOs, you still can sort of follow that process pretty robustly, and sort of rules for that are coming online here, sort of in the U.S. But you want to be able to make sure that even though the technology has the capacity to track and trace, and that you are still you're still looking and you're knowing sort of where it's going and what's happening there. And then the other sort of key component, I think, in the policy side, sort of how to treat and think about these digital assets is just in addition to the reserve requirement conversation that I discussed to protect against deep pegging risk, it's just like licensing, regulatory oversight, which is a very similar sort of conversation. Just if a development organization is going to be using this technology, just make sure that they are doing business with an organization that is regulated, sort of a licensed money transmitter, sort of here in the U.S. or the sort of the gold standard of digital asset licensing in the U.S. is the New York State Department of Financial Services virtual currency license. But effectively, you submit yourself to sort of oversight by these prudential regulators, so that these development organizations, they're often operating in areas, very vulnerable populations. You want to make sure that you're using a tool that is trustworthy and reliable and sort of can deliver on the objectives that you have. So those are some of the risks that I would talk about there, but that's mostly go to the underlying technology, the underlying asset class. Right. And then but you pointed out some sort of broader risks about how does this actually affect your development goals in the long run. But that's maybe a little bit outside my purview.
A big question. Have we seen any malicious actors in this space? Predatory, or, you mentioned the stable coins are regulated and you want to use.
Let me tell you about algorithmic stablecoin, just to maybe give you sort of an example. And so like we have seen organizations represent themselves as stablecoins historically, they were not issuing a token that could credibly be backed one-to-one by a US dollar. And so the biggest algorithmic stablecoin ever issued came out of a South Korea, and it was called Terra Luna. So this stablecoin, its peg was not maintained by one-to-one reserves. Its peg was maintained by sort of open market buying and selling of the currency, where if the price sort of floated outside of whatever the acceptable band was, Terra Luna itself would intervene to correct, which is not too dissimilar to how a central bank operates, right? Except for the fact that central banks can print their own legal tender, and Terra Luna was a private corporation in South Korea. And so that their ability to sort of maintain their own peg over time, without actual dollar reserve assets became very, very limited as the market capitalization of the stablecoin got bigger and bigger and bigger. And sort of eventually they could no longer maintain the peg by sort of by sort of participating in the cryptocurrency markets. $88 billion of stablecoin was wiped out sort of overnight. And that sort of had trickle effects into the wider digital asset space. And so you would saw in 2022, so like several sort of hedge funds in Singapore sort of got caught up in that takedown, and you had sort of a ripple effect of people that held those assets. Those assets effectively, went to zero overnight, and you sort of had a cascade effect of sort of digital asset oriented investment institutions that were tied to them. And so you don't want to be doing development work and in a space where suddenly sort of an asset that gets very entwined with your operations is in a similar situation.
Now, have we seen anything like that happen in the
No,
development space? Okay.
no, because for the most part, like development actors have been doing a very good job of sort of screening and working with like stablecoins that have great sort of proofs of reserves, stablecoins that are well collateralized, well capitalized, are fairly well licensed. Like a lot of the international aid and development work that I'm familiar with, like runs on Circle's stablecoin USDC, which is sort of the gold standard among the stablecoins that are currently in circulation. And I think has been a lot of hesitancy in the development and sort of aid community to engage with and use this technology operationally. And this risk aversion sort of has been very helpful to them sort of in the early stages while the regulatory framework for this stuff was coming online. I'm sure someone has made a mistake and done a business with one of these stablecoin issuers that wasn't reputable. It's for the most part, my understanding is that like the partnerships have been with some of these more well-regulated organizations, and when they've worked with them, they've sort of seen enormous success in sort of achieving the speed, the agility, the disintermediation goals that they're looking for. But like again, like you and I have like when I was in graduate school, with you, just a little over, 3 years ago, working there at the CGM, like we saw maybe one of the first and sort of best examples of the agility of this tech in the aid space when the Kiev School of Economics was sort of
Right.
accepting donations via digital assets, right? And you had this situation where the Ukrainian banks were sort of rightfully, in panic mode, trying to figure out how to respond to everything that was happening on the ground. And the Kiev School of Economics said, well, we have an Ethereum address and we can take Ethereum
Yeah.
tokens and liquidate them on the open market for sort of whatever currency we need and provide that to sort of humanitarian relief and aid groups on the ground in Kiev, which is and they're able to do that sort of overnight without needing to go talk to a bank branch, without needing to, the city was being shelled, without, needing to sort of, leave safety. So I just think it is such a compelling example of just like the agility that you can achieve with this. Now, in their case, they were, receiving donations in Ethereum, which is the same problem as Bitcoin. The underlying asset is very volatile, but it's still is the same underlying money transmission rails. It's fast, it's agile, and in these contexts where just like things have changed so dramatically and you don't know up from down, it can be very helpful. But yeah,
Where do you see things going, a year from now, 5 years from now? Are we on just the verge of a complete transformation,
so
or has this been
broadly,
over? Because a lot of people argue
no,
that
no,
this
no.
has just been hyped up, right?
So I think
Yeah.
I think there's been a lot of hype in, but the fact that the regulatory regime for an instrument like stablecoins now exists in the United States, and this is so. Before I go to development, I'll say sort of how I see it affecting things more broadly. There is enormous institutional interest in stablecoin, um, and sort of like what can they be used for? How can we move money with them? And you're seeing banks in the United States start to experiment with them over the summer. You were seeing sort of like large American retailers seeing how can we experiment with stablecoins for our own like internal accounting, right? Because these benefits that we were talking about in the development context are also just as valuable in the sort of the standard sort of private economy context, right? You want traceability and auditability of funds on a public ledger for when you need to be able to do your quarterly reporting, for your publicly traded corporations. You're going to need to, like, disintermediation saves costs, not only moving money to Haiti, but it saves costs moving in money around and conducting invoices, as someone operating a supply chain on the scale of Amazon. You're seeing a demand for, like, again, like the agility of the technology, the speed of the technology, but also they want the volatility problem of the underlying digital asset solved. And now that there's sort of a credible instrument in the form of stablecoins, there's a lot of experimentation with it in a
Okay.
way that previously you hadn't seen. Institutional level experiments with stablecoin just were not happening. The risk was too high, the trust wasn't there. And I think a lot of the stablecoin issuers in the US that are compliant, that are following the rules, have done a very good job of explaining their value proposition. And so that's sort of in the domestic sort of
Right.
US economic context, there's a lot of excitement, a lot of experimentation, a lot of activity, a lot of growth. But then in aid and development, I think you're seeing that sort of happening at the same pace in parallel. A lot of that being driven by like the scarcity of funds, like public funding being cut, and like how can we deliver as much value as possible with the dollars that we have. I think that is sort of the pressure that would move adoption in the development finance space.
Mhm.
But I would be very interested to sort of see how some of these early pilot programs scale, like the direct cash transfers, because historically it's been very expensive to sort of time consuming to sort of onboard people into programs with these direct cash transfers. And I think that this technology enables those kind of programs at a scale that you maybe have never seen before. So that might also be a change that we could see and could be tracking. And then just the the ability for local practitioners to sort of also get dollars like that. Although the amount of public sector funding is diminished, I think there is sort of a real opportunity to get more dollars in there into the development space in a more creative way using these rails. But I don't live and breathe it every day, so I don't know exactly how they're going to pursue it. But I think those are some of the advantages that people might want to realize.
And so you see sort of the most innovative work now being done. And the Haiti example, our colleague Paul Wong, who was on with us earlier,
Mhm.
Stellar Development Foundation is doing some very, very innovative work in this space. What else should we watch out for in the next year?
Something that, like, I think is interesting is, and we talked about this briefly, was like the Latin America context with like some of the central bank digital currency initiatives. You have countries like Brazil, Argentina, sort of now it looks like maybe even Bolivia that are also becoming very interested in how do we experiment with this technology and sort of make it easier to send and receive funds along these lines. I think like you're going to see states or national governments sort of start to be more interested in being active participants in how money moves along these rails. And some of it, I think, motivated by like what you mentioned earlier, Jen, the sort of the risk of their own financial systems getting a little disintermediated themselves, but also just like they want to be sort of part of the process. Like you see countries like sort of El Salvador that briefly made Bitcoin legal tender because of the huge remittance flows that were coming in and out of the country on that network. And still, sort of, there's a lot of the big remittance processing fintechs that sort of send and receive huge amounts of money around the world in and out of emerging markets are experimenting with moving stable coins. And just given like the size of like, the capital inflows coming not just from development but also from the remittance context, and sort of other maybe the emerging channels where you might just start to see stablecoin more and more. I think you're going to see like more national governments start to build out more comprehensive policy frameworks, and you're going to see them maybe taking a little bit more of an active role in how these pieces start to all fit together.
Wow. So we've covered a lot, Max, and it's been really great fun to work with you over the past several months on this project. When we started exploring this question of the future of development assistance, where we thought we would be going is focusing on the ways that aid development assistance can actually enable human agency. And one of the great challenges that we see in development assistance is that every donor likes to say that they allow the communities to drive development or locals to have a say. And there are many different strategies and techniques that people use, and NGOs and donors and governments use to do this. But I think the jury has still been out about the ways that whether aid can actually ever allow individuals to have a human agency just because they're the recipients of transfers from others. And in economic terms, when you create that relationship, you shift the principal agent problem. So the principal is the donor and the agent is the recipient rather than the other way around. It could be the case that one of the things that revolutionizes this relationship between donor and recipient is these technologies, which may make the individual much more in charge of these resources and how they spend their money and how resources are spent. I don't know what you think about that.
I think when you talk about the end user having sort of more control and ownership over the assets, I think it's a sort of a valid point. I've heard that come up more and more, right? You can have the digital assets sort of in a wallet, and it is sort of a tokenized representation that of dollars of another local currency. Uh, that you could freely move around and sort of transact with in the economy. it, it's it is sort of different than anything else you've seen before. Like a point that sort of came up in the conversation we had earlier with Paul Wong is people in emerging markets start to have these digital wallets with these dollar backed or dollar denominated assets in them. Uh, does it create a world where like suddenly you're in Malaysia and you can start buying into the S&P 500? Right, you can start buying into, like what of the best sort of performing capital market in the world, and like what does that mean? Sort of unlocking like capital, right? Or allowing people to have like better like savings instruments or make a sort of the choice as to sort of where to allocate their own sort of scarce resources. And so even if it's not even in the development context, like it's not digital dollars that were transferred to people, right? Let's say you are just your own sort of small business owner, developing economy, but you choose to keep your assets in US dollars with a US dollar denominated stablecoin. And more like sort of products, assets, investment vehicles, savings vehicles that allow you to have a sort of a stake in an economy and equities markets that previously sort of were inaccessible. I think that's coming. I think it also gets back to the point that a lot of countries, they maintain currency controls for their own policy reasons and their own ends. And I think that at some point that might run up against that. But for the time being, it's looking like there's an opportunity for the people to really change how they are saving money all around the world. And that's sort of an interesting, intersection of agency with the technology is that you could be in Malaysia and you could have these dollar denominated assets and ideally you could get your hands on a dollar denominated in savings or investment vehicle that was safe, well regulated, secure, trustworthy, etc. But it increasingly it looks like the technology to enable something that like that at scale relatively cheaply exists. It's just like a policy question as to whether that's something states are interested in letting their people have access to, and that'll sort of remain an open question for the time being. But that's maybe how I'm seeing a little bit of the agency intersection. It's less in that development context, but it's just more broadly into sort of access, democratizing sort of access to capital and assets and savings. And I think that's something people aren't thinking about or don't really have an eye on, because we think about like the savers and the capital being very much, it's up here, it's in Europe, it's in North America, it's in Japan, it's in South Korea. But there's other sources of capital, might soon be able to participate too. So it might be interesting to track.
Great. Well, Max, this was so fascinating. As always, learned so much from speaking with you and learning from you. It's really just a blessing to have you as part of our family here at CGM, and just so grateful for all the time and energy that you put into sort of holding our hand through these discussions over the past several months. It's been really enlightening, and I hope that our community and walks away with some sense of optimism for what can be done for the possibilities. Of course, not everything is without risks, but I think you've laid out so very clearly what these technologies look like and how they can really benefit a lot of people. So thank you so much, Max, and just want to wish you and your family a happy new year.
Well, thank you very much, Jen. It was a pleasure to be here. Always happy to hang out with the CGM.